We've asked Dr. Alan Kane, who's a Jungian analyst practicing in Santa Monica and Los Angeles, to join us in talking about the women in men's dreams. So that's a big subject, right?
It is indeed. I think one of the things that is most difficult for men to come to terms with, in addition to trying to find some way of having identity as a man, is now how do they turn and deal with these other creatures here on the planet, one of which they came out of.
Yeah, right.
So,
and continually to be harassed by the rest of their lives, right?
Yes.
So there are three directions of a man's relationship to the feminine being, right? He comes out of his mother. He's always having to deal with women in his real life, and then he has this woman within, right? So what about, you were talking to me earlier about the difficulty in our culture of a man really taking seriously the inner feminine, because the culture sort of assaults him with projected images of the feminine.
yeah, I think there's a way in which it is so appealing to do the easy thing. And if you just take advertising and films and how absolutely driven and full they are of images of, if you will just buy this product, then you will have this wonderful relationship to the feminine, who happens, of course, to be in the form of this nubile blonde woman. And as if somehow sexuality is equals the feminine, and that's the end of the story. It's like all there is sexuality. And if you're going to relate to the feminine, it simply means you get to have a woman to have sex with. And that's about it. The rest of it is all work.
So that the image of the feminine for men is carried not only in his dreams, but in the culture in which he lives.
And I think almost more so, it's almost as if the culture is saying, you don't even have to think about it. We'll tell you what's going on. We'll tell you what you need to know about the feminine. And it really does frequently boil down to some fantasy we have from the movies about if you're the certain kind of guy, then you get to go off into the sunset with the beautiful and interesting woman. Or if you buy this product, then you get to take this object home. She's not even actually a person. She's just sort of like some fantasy figure.
So if a man is not having dreams about a woman, he could pay attention to his fantasies about women that he sees in advertisements or so on. And these are projections from the men, not depicting what real women are like, is what you're saying, right?
Yes.
So talk about projection. Just define it simply.
Well, projection is looking out into the outer world and seeing someone who has a characteristic that you find interesting and that you're drawn to as if it only existed in that person. My favorite example of it is when you go to a party, and in this case we'd say a man would go to a party, a social gathering, and look around the room and say there's 40 women in the room. 30 of them he wouldn't even notice. There'd only be the 10 that he had some projective resonance to, and they would be the ones who triggered some of his basic fantasies about women. 8 of them would be primarily just physical images and how well they matched up to his idea of what the sexually acceptable woman would be. He might have 2 that had a little additional quality, but they better look good too. So what we see out there is our fantasy of what level of development our own internal state is. And since I think so many men basically haven't developed very far along the process of any kind of relationship to their own masculine development, that's hard enough, but as a result, our relationship to the feminine is very, what would I say, polarized. I mean, we talk a lot about the virgin and the whore, or the Madonna and the whore, and I think that's really what it is. We only have two categories for women. And there's either these idealized women / mothers, or there are these whores that we have sex with, and the two simply don't go together. You can have sex, or you can have a caring relationship, but you can't possibly have the two together. And I think men are, they suffer from that. I mean, people might not find that something to be sympathetic to, but I think men are really trapped in that dichotomy.
And the culture doesn't help.
The culture doesn't help, makes it worse.
So that a man might, if he pays attention to his projections, his fantasies about women in the media and so on, to believe, to somehow take on faith that is a picture of his own feminine side.
Yes, and it's like to question that, reflect on that in some way.
It's mind-boggling, right, for him to realize
it's scary,
this is
because
really
it's hard work.
a mirror of myself.
Yeah.
And that would mean, if these are sexual images, then that means that primarily his feminine development is left at that very basic, just instinctive drive, right?
Yeah. I either want to be taken care of or I want to have a sexual fantasy fulfilled. I mean, I say to men in my office all the time, what we want is a mother we can have sex with. That's the solution to the problem.
So since you can't get that, you can get pornography and pretend you are, right? Or you can have a dream that actually has just such an image in it, for example, right?
And certainly sexual dreams are very, very common for men.
Very common.
But not particularly interesting. In the same way that a lot of pornography is pretty banal, most men aren't particularly impressed by their dreams of sexual fantasies.
In fact, often a man first coming into analysis will say, well, I don't dream. And I'll say, well, surely you dream something. Well, yeah, I have sexual dreams. And I said, well, tell me about your sexual dreams. Well, I just have sex. With whom? I don't know.
Some woman.
Right, just so that level of relationship to the feminine would be, on one hand, to compensate. He has sex with an unknown woman to compensate for his lack of relationship to his own feminine and to women. Yes. And on the other hand, it might also be that a dream where one is having sex with somebody is that you're really totally identified with that.
And interestingly enough, if you think about sex, among other things, is basically a connection. There is a way in which men, I think, are trying to find a way to connect to the feminine and simply don't know how to do it. I saw a wonderful film a few years ago called Something Wild with Melanie Griffin and Jeff Daniels. And it starts out, the first 10 minutes of the movie are the great male fantasy. He meets this strange, gorgeous woman who takes him to a motel and gives him all the sex he's ever wanted, and he thinks this is so great, but it's, now what do I do? And the rest of the movie is about how he has to come to terms with this woman fantasy as an actual person. And he gets involved with her life. And that's the thing mostly we're not willing to do, is to say, well, after you've met my fantasy, now go away. I don't want to have to deal with you as a three-dimensional person.
And that's what women complain about.
Yes,
too.
absolutely.
So that also, though, has an important effect on a man's sense of himself, because it means he's really robbed of a relationship to his own soul. He can't fantasize or know how to relate to his own feeling side, his own soul. So when he's just having sex with an unknown woman, he's mostly totally unconsciously identified with the feminine. So he's like a stormy bastion, right?
Well, again, he's stuck. I mean, I think for me, so much of this does go back to how one-sidedly we allow men to develop in this society. See, I think there's something, this will make some people unhappy, I'm sure, but I think there's some way in which we've got to acknowledge that part of how men, in fact, exist biologically is impersonal around the sexual issue. And the idea that for us as men to only have one relationship with a woman, particularly if it's only sexual, is like that's the model. And that doesn't work very well. We can think it ought to, but if you look around, it mostly doesn't. So what you end up with is a lot of men who are very resentful and or very guilty. And then they get angry at women because there's no room for the discussion on that particular topic.
And as the devil's advocate, I might say, perhaps the polymorphous interest in sexuality is a compensation for his lack of ability to relate to women, right?
It's the only way that we can think of to try and solve the problem. So if I could just have sex with her, then everything would be okay, seemingly. But then, of course, lots of guys do, and it isn't, and so we're back to square one again. So that's where the dreams, I think, are very helpful. They're one of the most unique resources, I think, for beginning to address this problem in a way that a man might begin to take seriously.
And we're saying that really, to begin with, to have any image of a woman show up in a man's dream means he's beginning to have the possibility of developing some consciousness about his feminine side, right? And when he's not conscious of that, Jung calls this mood possession, or he's possessed by the anima, so he's at the whim of his internal feminine without knowing what's in him. He doesn't know what he's feeling.
The worst forms of it, the worst caricatures of it, of moody and opinionated, and I mean, he's a real pain in the neck. It's like his feelings are hurt all the time.
Well, either that or he's so high you can't relate to him, right? That mood swings, or he's either ecstatic or he's hideously depressed. And either way, as a woman, it's very hard to relate to him because he isn't related to his own feminine side, right?
Yep.
Now, Jung then talks about these, he talks about 4 stages of the anima, which is Jung's way of kind of simplifying archetypal patterns, I think, but maybe they're helpful. Let's talk some about them. There's the first stage. Well, the first stage would be getting out of the mother into the anima, right? So when a man starts developing a relationship to his feminine, the first image, the first archetypal pattern that Jung mentions is Eve and Aphrodite, that whole realm of the feminine as sexual object, right?
Yes.
Or you mentioned also as mother of the world, right?
Well,
that
Eve is an interesting character because she is our, in the Judeo-Christian thought, she is the original mother, but she's also the one who gets us out of the mother. I mean, if you think of the Garden of Eden as a kind of womb-like place where nobody's very aware, that it's her action with eating of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil that prompts the motivation forward. And frequently women have that function in men's lives. Either in outer sense, they are the inspirations or the temptations. They can seduce us into life. They can threaten us into life. They can nurture us into life. There's lots of ways they can do that. But when we talk about being animated, those first 5 letters are anima. I mean, that is the root of that. It just has to do with the spirit of life itself.
And so Eve would be the archetypal pattern of the feminine that tempts men out of this kind of infantile Garden of Eden into a real relationship with life.
Good example of that is a dream where a man, for instance, is sitting around watching television and a woman that he either knows or doesn't know says to him, "Come on, let's go outside." And that like breaks up that kind of sort of unconscious containment that he's got and gets him out into some other possibilities. And that, with variations, a very common male dream image.
In fact, probably Eve is the archetypal pattern of the anima when a young man falls in love for the first time. It's with his Eve. And she says, "We're not going to your mother's house for Thanksgiving," right? Or in men's dreams, these would be the figures that somehow beckon men into a new place, right?
And it could be a very dangerous place. It's the Lorelei who tempts you into the depths and you may drown there, but it also can be the woman who takes you around the corner into a whole new world.
When weaving meaning out of a dream in which a woman appears to a man, one needs to be concerned about the dreamer's relationship to the woman, her position in his life and her relationship to him, as well as her condition itself, whether she's bedraggled and abandoned, or whether she's wildly sexual in nature, or whether she's attacking, or whether she's beautiful and lovely. The position and condition of the woman in his dreams tells a man about his relationship to his soul and her condition, whether she's in a state of well-being or a state of disrepair. It also tells about, perhaps reflects his attitude toward women in his personal life also. The woman in a man's dreams often appears in a very erotic position. Men's dreams about women are often very erotic in nature. And as a man works with the anima, he is encouraged to not just blindly accept her sexual favors, too quickly blunting out whatever kind of conscious relationship he might have with her, but to explore with her a more conscious, loving relationship. I had a discussion with Jim about the anima and how she appeared to him in his dreams.
Well, the outcome of that is I decided to leave town to move to Japan, and I told you earlier about this dream that I had. Before I moved to Japan, I dreamed of an anima figure that was walking down a road maybe 20 or 30 yards ahead of me, similar to a painting that I can recall by Munch. I don't know if it's The Scream, but there's another Munch painting in the Getty, and it's going along, I think, in oceanfront or along a path, and there's a figure there. But anyway,
and you see the back of the figure.
Yes.
Right. And
Yes.
the main feature is her long
dark
hair.
and she's shorter, and I assumed she was Asian because shortly after that I moved to Japan, and I lived there, and it's a kind of a coincidence that when I did move to Japan, I met my wife almost immediately, my future wife.
Yes.
And we got married about a year and a half later in Japan, like
That's
I
wonderful.
told you, and
Right.
then we moved back here. And I don't know if that was a direct message. The dream was a message. I didn't realize at the time that I had the dream that it may have been telling me something. But upon retrospect, the dream turned out to be an important dream for me because
It's a beautiful experience,
yeah.
as if you have an Oriental soul. And you followed her.
Yes, and not only that, one of the reasons I moved to Japan is because of my interest in Zen.
What about a negative woman in your dreams, a destructive?
Well, the one that I'm still dealing with is I don't have this recurrent dream anymore, or not much to speak of, at least. I had a recurrent dream of a prostitute, or at least, but it was a young woman, maybe age 15 or 16, and kind of shabbily dressed. And I knew she was a prostitute, even though in the dream there was really no overt sexual content to it. But it was kind of disturbing, and I had that dream at the same time about the same time in my life when I had the dream of the other anima, more
the positive side. Sometimes the prostitute in a man's dream is actually a just right compensation for a negative mother complex, because a prostitute is the image of selling herself to the man, that the man uses her, whereas a man's feeling about the negative mother is that she uses him, as if all his energy is appropriated to the mother's needs to fulfill her image of what he should be as a man. On the other hand, in just listening to you about the prostitute, I think another way to look at it is that sometimes a prostitute could be an identity with the way you prostitute yourself.
Yes. Yeah.
You know, like in Western culture, men say they prostitute themselves by doing a work that's really against their nature, right? I sell myself for money, right? Does that...
And that rings a bell, because that's the way I've approached it.
Yeah.
And I've tried, not very directly, but kind of subtly, to apply that reasoning to how I approach my work.
Right.
Things
That's
that I'm doing.
such a compassionate, an image in a dream which stirs up such compassion, right? That you see this bedraggled prostitute, and it helps remind oneself of what kind of condition your soul is in, right? That she is being sold. You're like her pimp when you're living a life that prostitutes your soul, you know.
I think maybe, this is reflected in my own work that I'm doing as a teacher.
Yes.
I feel more and more benefit from, and more good feelings about the work and response to the work as time goes on. And in the process, I have less and less of these prostitute dreams.
That your soul is happier.
Yeah.
Right?
And of course, I'm still making the effort to make the most out of the real work that I do.
Right.
Whether or not it's the work that I feel that I really want to do.
Right.
The fact that I'm doing it, and the fact that I'm trying to make the most out of it.
And trying to keep your soul in the work.
Yes.
Right. Not abandon her again. So what we're talking about is the differentiation for a man between his mother complex and his anima energy, right? And that's often a lifetime work. If a man has a positive mother complex, he can find himself supported, but at the same time contained in his mother's own idea about what his life should be like, which is often either living out some of her unlived fantasies or a very collective life. You know, that a mother's animus is often very much carries the collective values of the culture, right? And so for a man to really grow up and find himself, he has to find the non-mother woman in his dreams, like you have, of this girlish figure, right? And then a more mature woman, and really take the courage to follow her, even when there's the fear that the mother will kill you. A man's relationship to his anima is colored by his relationship to his mother. If a man's experience of his mother is a negative one, the anima will continue her poisonous sting, stopping whatever he is doing with poisonous remarks about its value, or poisoning him with feelings of despair, feelings of paranoia, uncertainty and insecurity, and dark moods of despair, keeping him feeling pretty insecure and uncertain. And he has to confront that negative anima and free himself from her grip. On the other hand, if his experience with his mother is too good, as it were, the mother is too protective, too overprotective, and too invasive in a man's life, the man will appear effeminate. He will still have his mother's mark upon him. He'll appear effeminate on one hand, or on the other hand, he might find himself primarily in positions with women in which he's like their servant, that he's more interested in serving the woman's needs than his own needs.
Well, I think that issue of how men are trying to deal with that, because well, let me come at it from a funny angle, because I had a discussion this week with somebody about there being no male heroes. We were talking about movies, and we were laughing. It's like you're reduced down to either Sylvester Stallone, Arnold Schwarzenegger, or Forrest Gump. You know, it's like
it's pretty limited.
So
right?
Men either are sort of jerks, or they're good boys who nobody feels particularly. I mean, they don't have enough oomph for a real woman, or else they have to beat them up and blow them away. I mean. And I think there's a way in which that issue is partly got to do with our inability to have a relationship of understanding around the mother dynamic.
What do you think that image of either the wimp or the kind of rebellious one is in relationship to the mother archetype?
I think that's a big piece of it, because there's a way in which if I haven't had some kind of resolution of my relationship to mother by either getting enough support when I needed the support and enough freedom and encouragement, even to the point of being kicked out of the nest. One of the best images I ever saw of this problem was of a guy who was in a giant bird nest. He was trying to climb out. His father's standing on the outside of the nest, stomping on his fingers, and his mother's on the inside of the nest, holding onto his waist.
God, what a powerful image.
But it seems to me that that's very much what we're struggling with.
Kind of a collective image of where the masculine is right now, or where
no place
men
for him
are
to go, and he's like being drawn back
Right.
into it.
Right.
So it's extremely difficult. And I think men are left with the image of wanting to relate to women around being taken care of.
That a woman doesn't want to be cast
No.
in the role of mother.
Yeah. Nor does she want necessarily to have you take care of her. So
That's
it's not
right.
about you being father
That's
to her. There's a way in which I think men do need to do certain things to take care of women in an appropriate manner out of the kinds of skills, resources, and so on that they have.
Mutual regard,
yes, but
not
of
out
mutual
of
regard.
mother
Exactly.
thing.
So it's the
Right,
mutuality for me, which is increasingly the critical issue. But where in the world do you see it modeled?
Right.
You know, most of us didn't grow up in a relationship of watching mom and dad be mutually respectful.
Right. Actually, what we find in our consulting rooms is more men coming right with either a personal relationship in which their wife is not doing right because she's not being a good mother,
Yes.
or they're caught in being a mother themselves.
Yes.
Yeah. What do you think? What is it like in a man's dreams when his personal mother shows up? Like if he's in his mother's house.
Yeah, I think the idea of being with the mother, in the mother's house,
In the mother's bed.
in the mother's bed, in the mother's clothes. I mean, there's all those ways in which mother can literally, my personal mother can show up in a dream. And I think it is always about some aspect of incomplete work that was done between us. Some expectation or need I had from her that did not get met, which I am going to carry around in its unresolved state, looking for some actual woman out there to do for me.
Suppose a man dreams that he's in the situation of kind of contained in the mother, like in his mother's house and locked in there. How do you go about helping get him out?
Well, I think a lot of it has to deal with what his sense of that dream. In other words, for example, 3 or 4 different men could have that exact same dream.
Right.
And for one man, it might be very healing to be able to finally go back to mother and get something from her.
Like a second birth.
Yes. For another man, it might be about he had consciously done everything he possibly could to stay out of his contact with his mother. And it's letting him know that, he hasn't moved 10 feet from where he started.
And in a compensatory way, that's where he is. Yeah, like a rebellious one might dream he's locked in his mother's house to remind him that he's just rebelling.
I haven't got that far, I haven't really moved from that. So it would have to do with what specific associations that given man would have. It would say something about what kind of work he would need to do. For some men, it means going back and engaging the mother in some direct manner and trying to, not fix her, but to understand what could be communicated. And a lot of it has to do with beginning to accept that mother as an actual limited person. There's a whole bunch of moms out there who did the best they could. They really weren't evil. They were just incomplete.
He has to separate his actual mother from
his archetypal need to be needed,
to
to be taken care of.
Do you help men with that, like in an insight ways? One way you've talked. Do you have a particular way of helping them do active imagination with such a dream, or a ritual or something?
That's I think active imaginations are good because it's about having to say specific things. I'm not a big fan of, for instance, sending them to men's groups. I think men's groups, for me, tend to reinforce. They just kind of create another little womb together,
right?
And that's why I think the men's movement has more or less, if not died out, it's certainly not breathing life very vigorously from my point of view. And I think that the kind of thing that another man can do, either in a consulting room or in a friendship, is to create some place where there is a bridge out. If you think about the classic time of adolescence for men to be together,
right?
To leave the home, to be together, they're not quite ready to move into the father's world. Right. They're not quite ready for a primary relationship. Right. And there is something that we can do together. But I think some of it is like big group physical sporty stuff, but that's tougher to do, I think, when you get older. So it really has to do with, can you find somebody that you can actually talk to? Yeah. I find increasingly in my practice I'm getting men who are coming from exactly that point of view. Right. They're in their 40s and 50s, right. And they have been good, responsible citizens. They've married, had families. They've done the stuff that they're supposed to do. And there's some way in which no one ever talked to them about, well, what do you want to do? What's going on in you? Somebody to listen to their dreams. And I think it's good that they're coming to me as a man and not to women.
To women, right. So as a man, you can, for example, with the man in the nest, instead of being the father who says, oh, no, don't do that, that's dangerous, you can give him a ladder. Right?
Help him out, put a hand in there and say, boy, let's get you out of there.
And the second archetypal pattern, Jung called Helen, or the woman who carries the feminine aspect of aesthetic beauty, or probably wifely stuff, right?
She begins to make that transition, yes.
So as a man develops more, he might have a woman who's, dreams of a woman who's an artist, a co-worker?
I think that frequently I'm trying to think of a good example of how that would work. Helen is a very interesting figure because on the one hand, there's a way in which she's also someone who stimulates. I mean, she started a war, launched 1,000 ships. The idea that she can be possessed, I think, is the real difficulty. And when we fall in love and want to get married, I think it is frequently the Helen figure that we're drawn to, as if we could possess her. And one of the great mistakes, of course, is assuming you can possess anybody in this lifetime, much less your wife or your husband. And then the kind of anger that gets stirred up and the frustration when the actual human being that you marry isn't that way. And all the energy and time I've put out to go through the war, if you will, doesn't get me the prize I think it does. I'm not eternally comfortable and happy and satisfied. And then I start looking around for, if you will, secondary Helen figures. And then I might do it in the form of an artist, someone who is a little bit more interesting, has a little bit broader world, somebody who I work with, you know, and the reality, but it's also a caricature of the co-worker who, you know, we share work together. I can't go home to my wife because all she's done is raise kids all day, and she doesn't use any, you know, more than 2-syllable words anymore because the kids have fried her brain. But I put her down for that, even though they're my kids. And increasingly, there's a distance between the wonderful Helen figure that I married and the actual woman living at home in the traditional old frame. So now, who's the interesting person in my life? Well, this woman that, you know, we share the same business together. And she and I understand what real life is like. So we have something to talk about now. And we live in a larger world than the wife stuck at home.
So with a coworker, a man now has an experience of a woman of equal value
Yes.
who helps him experience himself as able to relate to the feminine. Now that would be the positive side if he doesn't have to
Exactly.
leave his woman and
Yes.
now project onto the mother of his children, the mother archetype,
Yes.
so he has to now leave her. So what you're saying, I think, is that a man needs to work between his experience of women in the world and his experience of women in dreams, right? That they often the projections,
Yes.
which would be the way the world carries his dream figure, feminine, and his dreams might keep stirring him to look at how he's related to his own feminine. And Helen then would be the woman, first of all, who carries the projection of just the basic feminine like himself. And particularly as co-worker, she's
Yes,
the new
yes,
interest.
yes.
She's inspiring.
She starts to become multi-dimensional. I can't hold the figure of more than one facet in one woman, so I've got to now have 2 women, and then 3 maybe too.
And if a man can hold that as a projection of his own development, he can then integrate that sense of himself, right, and bring it home to the woman he was married to,
Yes, and maybe
or
bring
maybe
her-
he needs to leave,
Yeah,
but he
yeah.
might bring her new life
Yes.
by drawing her out
Yes.
of her identity with the mother.
And might even, and this is fairly rare, but it does happen and it's quite amazing, he might begin to reflect on the idea that he has reduced the woman at home to a one-dimensional projection and start to reflect on, well, what's her life like? If I'm feeling trapped out in the world and only my coworker understands me, well, what's life like for her? And he might now come home and let her begin to be a person who's more multidimensional, multifaceted than he had thought of her before.
This relationship with the women in his life is often reflected in his behavior toward women in his dreams, right? Like, do men dream often about really being aggressive and violent?
Oh, yes. I think there's 2 very, I mean, in this pattern of being dominated by an aggressive, powerful woman.
Like the mother.
Like the mother, the sexual figure. I mean, he wouldn't dream about his mother dominating, but he would dream about a woman who was in charge and maybe filling some masochistic fantasies that he has. Or he might be a good guy who's like trying to be a responsible husband and worker and live in the world up to the standards that are set. But internally, he may be very angry at women because he's being a good boy. And he might have a variety of dream images of a very aggressive sexual nature, of controlling, beating, cutting, very hostile, sadistic images there, or simply just powerful ones. You know, that he's a big guy and everybody, all the women bow down before him.
To compensate for his feeling of being
Yeah, that
dominated
he's-
by the
that
feminine.
all of my decisions are being made by them, and there's nothing I can do about it.
So if a man has such a dream of being violent toward a woman in his dream, how do you advise him? What is he to do with that?
Well, always to start with is the idea of being respectful of the image, and that would be the first thing. And the second thing would be to say that this does not necessarily have to be literal, although there might be a dimension of that you want to take into consideration, that there probably are times he would like to, although being a good guy, he would never do this, but he would like to smack the woman in his life. And he may consciously be very down on people who do that, but some part of him might want to. I don't think it's a psychological mistake or surprise, I should say, that the O.J. trial has hit such huge response in people for a number of reasons, but including this one.
That passions fly so
Passion,
great.
and most people don't live passionate lives. They live very constrained, repressed, I'm going to be color inside the lines kind of thing.
That it doesn't excuse the behavior by any means, but it's a part of maybe a symbol
Yes.
of a cultural acting out.
And find a way to be able to face that kind of possibility. Yes, I am capable of that.
That's what seems the secret to me, that if a man sees himself violent in his dreams, it's really essential that he own
Yes.
his rage
Yes,
toward
yes,
women, and
exactly.
and to find a way
Yeah,
to express that in a related form.
Well, the irony, of course, is the reason I'm so rageful at women is I see them as having something that would save my life. So on the one hand, they're the most valuable things I can imagine, and they have the thing that can save me,
Right.
and they're not giving it to me, so now I'm rageful at them for not giving me the thing that could save me. I mean, it's...
that you have what I
yeah,
want
yeah,
and you won't
yeah,
give
yeah.
it to me.
And if you say
right?
you love me, how come I'm
Yeah,
unhappy?
Yeah. There's another image of the feminine that I have seen in more than one man's dream, of a strange image of the feminine where the woman in the dream is in a very masculine form. She might be like dressed up as a man, or she might be like one of
Trail
those
guide or something. Yeah,
pistol-toting
yeah,
cowgirl
yeah,
things,
yeah.
right? And these images seem to me to often come up in men's dreams who are basically pretty passive and pretty
Feminine
benign,
in the character.
maybe.
Yes. We would think they're not aggressive enough. So there's some way in which she's maybe, as a dream figure, trying to compensate for that and get him
That
in
the-
touch with that. Yes.
That the shadow and the anima then would be combined in one figure, like a pistol-toting sex woman.
Well, it also transcends our usual, I think, sensibilities about what kind of ways women can be manifest. You know, that it's not somehow enough to simply say, oh, a woman with a pistol-toting woman, some kind of lesbian or something, tomboy or Amazon, that's a legitimate form. And so there can be more than one way for the feminine to present itself relative to the particular dynamic of how this guy has developed as a
an
man.
Ego.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's compensatory and supportive at the
yes,
same
yes,
time,
yeah.
right? What about images of women in men's dreams where the woman is in distress? She's been abandoned or in some kind of distress.
Yeah, I mean, the classic one is like the woman in the castle has to be saved, or the woman being held by the dragon. And I think frequently that's about some way in which the woman needs to be free, the anima needs to be free, usually from some constraint, either that the man is psychologically imposed on himself, perhaps through an over-identification with his own mother figure or whatever. She could be the dragon. He's got to fight to get the woman free. But it's a call for him to be more than he has been before. And to create a position of self-evaluation. He could do the heroic thing. And then if he frees the woman, she can now frequently become the lover, the inspiration, the guide. I mean, she can take on any one of a number of roles, which he needs, that have been constrained. They have been held back. They have been captured. They've been trapped. And but they won't get freed until he takes an action. And so much of the time, I think men are sitting around waiting for women to tell them how to be men. And that is not their job. I have a friend of mine who says that you can get women to take care of you, but they'll hate you for it. And I think that's really true. And I think a lot of men do that. We want women to take care of us. And we can find ways to get them, manipulate them into doing that, but it doesn't pay off.
It doesn't work,
No,
does it?
no.
Right. Another image I've seen often is an image of like a flyaway woman. I remember my analyst years ago telling me that he felt the most victorious he had ever felt in a dream was when this recurrent dream of a woman in black, like a Victorian woman dressed in black, would come waltzing into the dream and float up on her umbrella and waltz through the house, and he couldn't get hold of her. And finally, he said, before I died, I finally did it. I got hold of her feet and I pulled her down to the ground and I had her. And I guess that flyaway anima would express this difficulty of really getting in touch with a man's feminine side,
Yes,
right?
I think that, and again, it's that issue of, on the one hand, you can't possess
Right.
the other, but on the other hand, if they're not solid enough, then you can't really have a relationship with them. So there's a way in which it's the opposite of, if you will, the woman who's tied up on the train tracks,
Right.
who has to be freed. Here's the woman who's so vague as a figure that needs to be brought down to earth. And frequently you encounter that in the outer world. There are actually
Right.
women who are hard to,
Right.
to pin down to some of the
encounter.
ethereal.
Right. And so when we women don't really tell a man what we feel or what our standpoint is, we act out this illusory anima, which drives a man wild, right? And that then encourages him to try to hold us more.
And frequently, of course, it gets concrete, so then we get angry. The only way we had to do it is like aggressively, okay, I'll pull you down to the ground.
Yeah,
and it's
yeah.
like,
And that
that
the
doesn't
battering
work.
would
Yes,
come
yeah,
out of,
yeah,
right?
that's where there's frustration and anger. And yet it's an attempt to solve a problem. It's not a good way to solve it, but it is an attempt to solve a problem when no other option is experienced.
There's another image of women in men's dream is the woman who's so incredibly evasive. She tempts a man and leads him into some new situation, and then she simply disappears. He loses touch with her again.
I'm at a college campus. I'm trying to find my dorm or my classes. I meet a very attractive young self-assured woman. She isn't very impressed with me. We walk to the Performing Arts Building together. We walk along singing another opening of another show. At the stage, she disappears.
This man's dream might well indicate that it's like every event is kind of like the first time, right? Another opening, nothing, he can't quite get hold of what play he's in, maybe, right? That when the anima disappears like that, she's always happily engaged in beginnings, but she can't really help him carry through with what he needs to carry through. Can you imagine what you would help him do with such a dream? How would you approach it with a man?
Try to get him some sense of how he would complete the dream. Okay.
That you
What
might
would
ask
Act
him to
Two
go
look like?
on.
Yeah,
I see.
Yeah. And just try to activate his imagination at that point rather than waiting for her to stick around. I'd say, well, what would you do? Okay, she's gone. Now what would you do?
Yeah, yeah.
And get him grounded.
Yeah, that could you, as like a mentor, or carry the positive anima who would encourage him then to go after her and find her if he wants to, right? If he
Or
wants
find
to
a
be in
different
the
kind
show,
of woman.
or find a different kind of woman. Yeah. We left the archetypal pattern. We talked about Eve, and then we talked about Helen as an archetype. The third stage of archetypal development that Jung talked about, he called the Virgin Mary, which would be that image of purity and idealism and a spiritual figure, right?
Mary's a unique figure because there's a way in which she is so spiritual and she's sort of beyond sex, and yet she is the virgin, and yet she is the mother, so she's
The virgin mother,
she's carrying two qualities here. And her major function is to be an intercessory, to help us to bridge between, if you will, earth and heaven, and to make intercession for us between earth and heaven. So that, I think, is one of the qualities that Mary has that is unique. We're not used to that. Mostly, I think we keep women in this world. Women should be tangible, and then we're back to they're either virgins or whores. And or Madonnas and whores in this case.
But for a man to allow a figure in his dream to really lead him into a deeper sense of the spirit in his life, right, would be the Virgin Mary archetype. I know there's often as men have worked for a while, there will be a very kindly woman who's almost angelic, and often in white diaphanous gowns, right, that represents the stage of the anima.
She'll show up obliquely almost.
Yeah,
you're off doing something else, and all of a sudden she'll be there, and it's easy to dismiss her. But she'll be the one who maybe says something simple or says, well, why don't you go down this way, and provides some other way of doing it instead of this sort of bull-headed, straight-ahead.
So that would be such a figure in a dream. It would be wise to really make a relationship with and learn to talk to her, to listen to her.
In the book that was out called Man and His Symbols, there's a dream where some of the same issues are brought up in terms of the church as that kind of figure, but also with someone in the dream that does that.
I'm in the aisle of an old church filled with people. I'm to celebrate the Mass as a priest, and I have a big Mass book in my hands, or rather a prayer book or an anthology of poems. This book is not familiar to me, and I cannot find the right text. I'm very excited because I have to begin soon, and to add to my troubles, my mother and wife disturb me by chattering about unimportant trifles. Now the organ stops, and everybody is waiting for me, so I get up in a determined way and ask one of the nuns who is kneeling behind me to hand me her Mass book and point out the right place, which she does in an obliging manner. First, the nun has to read a part of the liturgy before I begin, and I still have not found the right place in the text. The numbers are not clear and I cannot find it. With determination, however, I turned toward the congregation, and now I have found the number 15, although I do not know yet if I shall be able to decipher it. I want to try all the same. I wake up.
That's a beautiful dream, depicting the Virgin Mary archetype as a nun, right?
And in this case, the dream is of, as I recall, a Protestant man who was concerned that he did not have a spiritual orientation. And the interpretation that's made in the book is that he needed to become a priest in his own church. But it was a church with a lot of feminine. His mother and his wife are there, and even though they're chattering, they're part of his life. But there's this whole new dimension which is being evolved, and he's going to stand up and be, the priest to say the Mass in his own church.
And find the right chapter 15 or whatever, right? That this dream would illustrate a man's having developed a relationship with his feminine side through the mother, through the wife, and now to the spiritual leader who can induct him into being the priest in his own church, his own priest, as it were. I also know a dream that also shows a man having such incredible regard for the feminine and his difficulty in getting to it. It's a dream of a man about 60 who had his feminine repressed so, but he really felt bad about it. So the dreamer has a feeling of remorse about the way the feminine is being treated, but she's locked up in his basement.
There is a self-sacrificing woman tending a furnace, a wood-burning stove, in the basement of my house, which warms the whole house. The basement is a concrete vault. The woman is my age, a little fat, and has been very much ignored. She lacks definition as though her facial features are not sharply defined. I feel a little guilty about having her been neglected so long, and her having sacrificed herself for the sake of keeping my house warm.
So I think that dream would illustrate that the man is getting some consciousness of his feminine side, which is repressed, and of what great value she is to him, that she keeps
the home fires burning.
Yeah, that she stays doing her work, and that he wants to get at her, but his repressive mechanism is so great. Don't you guess the basement as concrete would seem to me a concrete image for the metaphor of concrete reality, that he can't quite get into this, can't get past a feeling of the unconscious needing to be concrete reality, but he has such feeling for wanting to pay attention to this woman who's left in the basement. So the feminine in its fourth stage, Jung talked about as Sophia, or Sapientia, right? The goddess of wisdom, or a woman in a man's dream as a wisdom guide, like the nun might be such a guide, right? Do you think of other such images in dreams? Or?
I was thinking about that, and I think they're relatively rare, so I was having trouble coming up with any kind of specific examples. The development that it would take to get to the place where you have that kind of relationship as a man with a feminine that's carried that far along, I think is, at least in my experience, personal and professional, is very rare. I think in outer terms, the images of the oracle at Delphi are an example of that, where there's a kind of disembodied voice. So in terms of dreams, I think frequently the idea that a message would be given, but not connected to anything. And it could come from on high, so it might be from the Father, but it could also come from nature, for example. One could hear it in music. One could find a connection to... insight is not a strong enough word. I think it's almost as if there's a whole new dimension added to one's experience as a result of that encounter. One is awed.
Right.
And I can't think of a good example, quite literally.
Well, perhaps,
Yeah.
I think you're raising an interesting idea, though, that I think these wisdom figures show up in men's dreams often as a relationship to nature, which is, interestingly enough, as if it's a return to the mother, but not as Mother Nature now, but as the man as protector of nature, like he might discover a spring that he needs to dig out and protect, right? Or a special tree that instead of being caught in it, or cut down, that he's to tend this tree and water it every day and feed it. Or I know a dream a man had of a very special horse that he was given that talked to him, that he really needed to pay attention to, so that something about that fourth stage of anima development comes around again
Yes.
to Mother in a different dimension, because Mother Nature would be the greatest advice we have.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And
Because it teaches us about the nature of life. And again, so I think that it probably is maybe more frequent than we might realize, but we're not used to thinking of it if it's not personalized. If there's not a female figure in the dream, then we don't recognize it as such. But the idea that the wisdom that can be learned, which is different from, say, if you will, the learning in the usual maybe patriarchal intellectual sense, which has its own value. But there's a kind of intuitive wisdom of life, and I think you're right, looking at animals or looking at nature and learning from them.
I wonder how many women there are in the collective who carry for men the projection of the wise woman, right? That's a dimension of human development that we still may be very shy of,
I think
right?
so.
There.
And I think there's a way in which we have two difficulties, I would say, as men. One has to do with, if there's not sex involved, we don't know what to do. We're really like, well, if I don't want to sleep with her, what good is she, you know? And the other is that a lot of the women, I think, who can speak in our society literally with some wisdom, it's much too easy to just wipe them out categorically. Oh, well, they're too strident. They're just animus possessed. You know, oh, well, she's just...
like Hillary Clinton.
Yes, Hillary Clinton vilified, or Bella Abzug, or Betty Friedan, or women who really have something to say about life that we can all benefit from. But I think it's very easy for men to just categorically dismiss them and not be willing to learn from them or to reflect on them. But I also think that there's a way in which they're not representatives of this fourth archetype. I think what they're more like is good wisdom than what I was calling the patriarchal sense. It's more intellectual. It's not about nature. And I think maybe we get that more from women who are poets and women who are songwriters, who have found a way to speak wisely, but more obliquely.
That's true, isn't it? That the poet, the woman as poet, can carry a sense of wisdom that's not just intellectual. And
Yeah, it bridges something there.
so that as the two work together, a man working with his feminine side and women trying to develop their masculine side, some new images occur in the culture as well as in the unconscious.
I think of Georgia O'Keeffe as well. I was thinking of artists and how we have much more willingness to learn from women artists, whether it's painting or poetry or music, than we do from women, say, writers. Some more there, but still I think we don't learn as much from them as we can. Like an Ann Tyler comes to mind, Ellen Gilchrist, Rita Mae Brown, Alice Walker. I mean, there's so much wisdom in what they're saying, partly because they're able to speak of just the way nature is, the way people are, and they can let that in.
After you have finished doing the thinking work of making associations to the woman in your dreams, weave these associations into the dream story so that you can experience how you treat certain qualities in yourself. What does she teach you about your life and the world? What does she show you about your relationships with other women? How can you allow her to become your inner confidant, giving value and meaning to your deepest, innermost self? Active imagination is one way of developing a relationship with your inner woman. Talk to her. Listen to her. Make a picture of her. Make a picture for her. Hold her in your waking imagination as you go about your day-to-day task, allowing her to become an essential part of your own nature. I talked with Jim about his efforts to use active imagination in relating to the anima figures in his dreams.
And I had to go through a lot of inner work to avoid making these projections. And in the process, I did things like I sketched an early anima figure that I had in my dreams 15, 16 years ago.
Do you remember the particular dream, the action in the dream?
No, I can just recall that I tried to get in touch with this anima that I was having. I would do active imagination. I would do dialogues. I would have for
Right.
evenings that I had free over a period of about a summer, I would have a dialogue between what I labeled the ego and the anima.
Right.
And
Help me understand was it a particular woman
yeah,
that you saw as the anima, or
yeah,
a
I
dream
tried
figure?
to bring up a general figure of an anima,
Right.
and tried to make it not any specific woman that I knew,
Right.
and hopefully an anima that I had dreamed about over a period of several dreams. But the most important thing was the feeling connected with this anima, and the fact that it was, like a guardian angel or a spiritual figure in my dreams.
So you just developed an imaginal figure
Yes.
with whom you would have conversations and
it was,
imagination.
It was nice to be able to have a sketch of this figure and
Yes.
actually have something that I could even visualize later.
Right.
But it was hard work to just sit down and carry on a conversation in my own
Right.
head and then write it out.
But there was a feeling that she gave you instruction in a
Yes.
right way,
Yes.
or
And I believe it was very helpful, and I believe it led to a lot of my own growth, and self-growth,
Yeah.
and development.
through the long and difficult work of relating to the women in his dreams, a man can become more whole, more individuated, less divided. He can free himself from the domination of the mother toward relating to and appreciating the motherly qualities in himself, his ability to care for, to nurture, and to hold. His life can become enormously enriched by relating to the transforming anima in his dreams, his own soul. In that way, he can know what he feels, what he wants, what he values. A man's relationship with his inner woman gives him depth and confidence, as well as receptivity and emotional stability. Our tapes on relationship and personality type also give additional material which might be helpful in working with the women in one's dreams, as well as the women in everyday life. Continue to join us in this ancient ritual of recalling and finding meaning in dreams.